Do you remember your hardest day at work? Like the worst one? The one that made you regret to have wakened up on this day? Or the one that could make you curse your very own employer because regulations of what's gonna happen will emerge soon and what you're taking part of is something that no one could actually even anticipate? Well, turns out that this very bad day at work was what's gonna happen to the crew of Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 305 on this afternoon of the 24th of November 1971. And this day was a crucial day for Tina McClough, a 22-year-old woman recently hired for a new job and turned out to be quite decisive for her future. No, on that day she didn't fail to provide any PowerPoint on time or fail to meet the sales objective. She didn't have her moody manager with her. She didn't fail to execute anything she was asked. No, and if you want my opinion, she'd certainly rather have preferred to have to deal with one of those things. No, on that day, she was sat down on an aircraft flying right next to a man pretending he had a bomb whilst the plane was en route to Seattle. Yeah. Now, have you ever wondered why, when you're going to airports, the security is so stringent and you cannot even carry bottles inside an aircraft? Or have you ever wondered why they are so picky about not letting you in without a proper ID or passport? Now, fellow travelers of the unknown, please grab yourself a coffee and make yourself comfortable, and let me tell you today the story of the mysterious life and disappearance of D.B. Cooper.
Thank you and enjoy your flight.
Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 305 was a scheduled flight operating from Portland, Oregon to Seattle, Washington on the 24th of November 1971, ironically on Thanksgiving Eve. It was operated on this day with the aircraft registered November 467 Uniform Sierra, a recent Boeing 727, and it was operated by a crew of 6 people, amongst which Captain William Scott, First Officer William Ratazak, and a mechanical officer named Harold Anderson. There was also Flight Attendant Florence Schaffner and Tina McClough, as well as Alice Hancock. The flight boarded 37 other passengers who would later be completely unaware of the current situation. Nothing specific was to declare on this day, at least in the cockpit, apart from the fact that the weather wasn't great and as such pilots knew that the flight was expected to be a bit turbulent. I mean, saying that would soon become a bit of an understatement. Now, before we go on anything, let's talk a bit about the Boeing 727 in itself. The aircraft was, back in the days, the only Boeing aircraft that never truly looked like the current variants that we see today, and this one, which is no longer in commercial service today, had a lot of peculiarities. First, it had its 3 engines in the rear side of the aircraft and not under the wings as modern Boeings do, which for pilots was definitely a plus in the event of an engine not working, which would considerably be an advantage, so we wouldn't have to use the rudder too much to maneuver the aircraft in case of an emergency landing. Yet, just like any airplane model, the Boeing 727 had its fair share of issues, amongst which to have a relatively short range, and it was merely used for domestic flights, but it was also very noisy, and this led to several countries to eventually ban it from its airspace just because of that. But the Boeing 727 had this very own peculiarities, which was to have a retractable staircase in the rear section of the aircraft, just under the tailplane, along the front and rear doors, and it was sometimes used to disembark passengers. The staircase could also be used in flights, at least until this very flight, and this peculiarity will turn out to have great consequences in today's events. Either way, the story of today, like I mentioned, won't happen in the cockpit, but elsewhere. First, it was before the flight that a man in his mid-40s showed up at Portland Airport and purchased a ticket for Seattle. Yeah, before the invention of the smartphone, you could actually do that. I mean, you can still do that today in some airports, but everything is mostly done online nowadays. This man identified himself as Dan Cooper, but since no identification proof were required, he paid his ticket cash in hands. The guy was described by eyewitnesses as a white male in his mid-40s, wearing a black business suit, black or brown, this remains however unclear, had a white shirt, a thin black tie, a black raincoat, and brown shoes. He carried, however, a briefcase and a brown paper bag. He was also described as someone with dark, short hair and brown eyes. He purchased the ticket for the seat 18 Echo in the very last row of the aircraft, and once on board before takeoff, he ordered a bourbon and a 7-Up. Yeah, because back in the days you were allowed to be served drinks before takeoff once in the aircraft, which I'm pretty sure may have led to funny situations during takeoff and climbing phase. Anyway, Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 305 got granted takeoff clearance on time at 2:50 Pacific Standard Time, and took off on time, performing an absolutely normal takeoff. The flight to Seattle wouldn't be very long, and it was scheduled to fly for half an hour, but weather wasn't really great on that day, so usually during short flights, planes aren't climbing very high, and it's unclear what altitude the airplane was flying on that day, but most likely it didn't fly very high. But, like I mentioned, Cooper purchased the last row's tickets, and it's during takeoff that things would quickly become interesting. Usually, you may have noticed that during takeoff, flight attendants are always seated on jump seat next to the front and rear doors, but for this flight, those jump seats were right behind our passenger Dan Cooper, who, shortly after takeoff, handed a paper note to flight attendant Florence Schaffner, sat right behind him. At first, Schaffner dismissed the note, and she just folded it and placed it in her purse because she thought that it was, again, one of those lonely businessmen giving his phone number because he was looking for a bit of fun. Yeah, this used to happen, certainly the joys of being a flight attendant. But this paper would trigger her interest very shortly, as Cooper leaned towards her and said, "Miss, you'd better look at that note. I have a bomb." So Schaffner opened the note, and in a neat, all capital letters, Cooper had written, "Miss, I have a bomb in my briefcase and I want you to sit by me." And as a clever and probably cautious move, he asked Schaffner to return his note. Schaffner, understanding the critical urgency of the situation, immediately complied with Cooper's demand and sat next to him and, very professionally, quietly asked to see the bomb. Cooper opened his briefcase, and she could see inside 2 rows of 4 red cylinders that looked like dynamites, all wiretapped to what she had assumed and described to be a battery, which was also large and cylindrical. After having shown that, he closed the suitcase, and here was about to start quite a stressful situation. Schaffner understood the seriousness of the situation, and Cooper told Schaffner of his demands, and those demands were expected for some, but peculiar for others. First, he asked to have delivered upon landing at Seattle $200,000 in cash in a knapsack by 5 p.m. Also have delivered 2 front parachutes and 2 others in the back. But one important detail, he wants the money in negotiable American currency. Now at this stage you may be wondering, okay, so that's a heist, and yes it is, but 4 parachutes? Yeah, because it was not excluded that hostages could be taken. So it would prevent authorities from providing non-functional equipment. Yes, here we go. Once the plane successfully climbed and stabilized, now en route to Seattle, Schaffner managed to have Cooper's demand written in order to remain discreet and not making a panic amongst other passengers. And she headed to the cockpit to inform Captain Scott of the current situation. At this stage, Captain Scott understood what was going on, and he told Schaffner to stay with him for the remainder of the flight and make note of what was going on. Meanwhile, Captain Scott gave the commands to his first officer and contacted his head office located in Minnesota through radio, informing of the current situation of the flight. And it's here that our lovely friend Tina McClough enters the stage. As she left her seat, Schaffner ordered her to remain sat down with Cooper until he comes back so she could act as a liaison between Cooper and the cockpit. As they wanted to keep things discreet in order to avoid panic, it was all about keeping it as an inside job, and that's why McClough was forced to stay here so Schaffner could remain in contact between Cooper and the flight deck. And it's here, if you think you had a bad day, imagine the flight attendant's workload at this situation. Your flight to Seattle might be quick, but you have now a terrorist sitting next to you on board. And a guy who seemed to be a skilled con artist. Either way, as the flight continued, with now Captain Scott in touch with Northwest Orient Airlines head office, waiting for instructions, our first officer continued flying as scheduled to Seattle. Of course, everybody was informed, but the calm remained on board, with passengers oblivious of the ongoing mess that was taking place right behind them. Seattle ATC, or Air Traffic Control if you missed the Air Florida episode, was now informed that there was a problem on board of Flight 305 and as a result contacted the local police and the FBI. But in the meantime, Cooper made additional demands. Upon landing, passengers must remain seated until McClough brings the money inside the airplane, after which passengers must disembark. Meanwhile, the airplane must be refueled, ready for departure again. Oh yeah, and in his demand he also asked for this. Cooper asked to have someone subscribing to this channel. Oh no, wait, that's something else. At this stage, for the crew, things were quite strange, but in the end made some kind of sense. At this stage, informed of the situation his crew was, Donald Nyrop, the CEO of Northwest Airlines at the time of the incident, authorized the payments and ordered the entire crew, whether on ground or in flight, to comply with Cooper and his demands. But of course, this took a certain time, and approaching Seattle, the Boeing 727 got denied landing clearance and instead was given a holding pattern, waiting for landing clearance as nothing was really prepared, and the other idea was to make sure that all the fuel inside the aircraft would be burned, so it would leave the airport staff as well as police extra time to have everything organized on time when the plane lands. But the holding pattern the airplane was given was above the water in the Puget Sound in order to make sure that if Cooper goes crazy and detonates the bomb, then no damage would be done to local habitations. The captain at this stage had to announce to passengers via a PA that due to unforeseen circumstances, the airplane was to be delayed by 2 hours for landing in Seattle due to minor technical difficulties. But one thing came flagged during the subsequent investigation following the incident. Cooper seemed to have an excellent knowledge of the terrain. For example, on the flight path of Flight 305, he perfectly recognized the city of Tacoma on the ground, and he also recognized from his window seat the presence of the McCord Air Force Base not far away from Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. McClough said about his behavior that he was not nervous at all. They actually talked during the flight, and McClough, when Cooper asked her where she was from, stated that she was originally from Pennsylvania, but she was currently living in Minneapolis. He also said that Minnesota was a very nice state. In return, she asked him where he was from, and he refused to respond and becoming upset. But when McClough asked him why he picked Northwest Airlines for his hijack mission, he laughed and replied that it's not because I have a grudge against your airline, it's just because I have a grudge. In fact, he was confident and seemed to be a nice guy, not cruel or nasty at all. And even as a gesture of sympathy, Cooper offered a cigarette to McClough. Even though she replied that she had to quit, she still took the cigarette. But either way, passengers got quite frustrated by this delay and of course started moving on and about in the aircraft. Either way, the other reason as to why the plane didn't receive the clearance was also because at the same time the ransom was being gathered and it was placed in a bag weighing about 8 kilograms and consisting of 10,000 $20 notes, all having a specific serial number issued by the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco. At the same time, the police managed to obtain the parachutes from a local skydiving school and another stunt pilot. Then, once everything was gathered, Seattle ATC cleared the aircraft for landing, and at 5:46, Flight 305 successfully and safely landed at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. Considering the fact that this mission was slightly special and of course in agreement with Cooper, the aircraft parked on a partially lit runway away from the main terminal, and there some strange gathering was about to take place. Once the aircraft was taxied and parked, Cooper requested to have a representative of the airline coming with the parachutes and the money, but also requested another very important thing. If someone was to enter or leave the aircraft, it would be via a mobile staircase unit through the front door. The operation manager of Northwest Airlines was now in charge of going to the aircraft for the ransom transaction. And as per Cooper's directives, McClough exited the aircraft to get the money and the parachutes for coming back inside the aircraft afterwards. And then the transaction between McClough and the manager of Northwest Airlines went without issues, but meanwhile people were wondering why they weren't allowed to disembark straight away and why so much of a drama on the ground now that the engines were off. But the secrecy remained. McClough came back inside the aircraft carrying the money, of course in front of every other passengers, and delivered it to Cooper as instructed. But that was the deal. You have the money, now the passenger need to be disembarked, and as agreed, Cooper allowed the passengers to be calmly disembarked afterwards. Of course, before that, he counted the money, checking if everything was in there, while still holding everyone on board with the threat of the bomb to detonate if his demands are not met. Everybody was allowed to disembark, but the entire crew must remain on board. And a funny story happened at that moment when McClough asked Cooper, as she saw him with all the cash, if she could still have a little bit of it. And I would have certainly done the same thing to try to soothe the tensions. And Cooper was like, "Oh yeah, of course," handing her a pack of bills, but McClough declined, saying that it was against the company's policy to accept tips from a passenger. But of course the money was there, and the parachutes were still to be delivered. McClough was in charge of getting them, but in the meantime, Cooper, the pilots, Schaffner, and the last flight attendant Alice Hancock were still on board. Schaffner politely asked if Cooper could retrieve her purse, to which Cooper replied, "I won't bite you," and then asked if they could, with Hancock, leave the aircraft. Whilst Cooper needed McClough on board, increasing somewhat the psychological pressure over her, he said to Schaffner, "Whatever you girls like." Personally, if I were McClough, I'd have been upset with my two colleagues. Either way, whilst McClough was now retrieving the parachutes, Cooper instructed the pilots, "Now we need to refuel the aircraft and take off again. This time, direction Mexico." But the problem was, Seattle, Mexico is, for the Boeing 727, impossible to do in one go. A refuel was needed at least at Reno, Nevada, in order to pursue with the flight. At least that's what Ratazak told Cooper. But at this stage, perhaps the grand final of the plan was scheduled in Cooper's mind, so he accepted. Either way, the refueling of the aircraft was ordered, and it took longer than expected due to the fact that other aircrafts requested refuels and other trucks were sent to the aircraft in order to make it faster. But either way, three events happened during the time the refuel was taking place. First, Cooper complained that the money was delivered in a different bag, requiring him to review his plans, but that didn't seem to make him more upset or even threatening. Second, an FAA official so the FAA is the American Aviation Authority, FAA standing for Federal Aviation Authority, requested a meeting with Cooper, but this was, of course, declined by him. And third, Cooper asked that, during takeoff, the aft staircase would be deployed and remain open during the flight. And it's here that things would really become interesting and gave a different angle to the investigation that followed. From a pilot's point of view, the first officer stressed Cooper that taking off with the aft staircase deployed was absolutely unsafe, but Cooper said that it can easily be done, so it will be done. And in a way, he was right. Taking off required an important speed and that would, in the end, damage the aircraft, but Cooper knew at this stage that it could be done, meaning that he had a good knowledge of the aircraft in itself. Second, he asked the pilots to make what was certainly the most dangerous flight of their lives. The plane must not climb above flight level 100 or 10,000 feet and must not exceed 100 knots in speed. Cabin must remain unpressurized, of course, and with the landing gear deployed during the flight, flaps must remain deployed at 15 degrees. And it's here that it gives a certain clue as to who Cooper could have been. Oh yeah, and of course McClough must remain on board in order to assist him. Yeah, when I told you that it was such a nice day for her, she must have been living the dream. Throughout his request, we could identify here someone who has perhaps either been a pilot or has been initiated to piloting. Through his request, it clearly highlighted that he wanted the aircraft to remain close to the minimum speed to avoid a stall or loss of lift. If you guys want to know more about stalls, please listen to the Air Florida episode. Now, the altitude. He also knew that reaching flight level 100 would be high enough, but not too high, where he could still be able to breathe, as past flight level 100, you need to have the aircraft pressurized. You can still breathe at this altitude, but it's gonna be very hard. It was reported that the way he handled the parachutes indicated that he was someone who knew well what he was doing when he cut the canopy with a knife he had on him. Now, you guys may wonder, how comes he could be able to say with a certainty that the aircraft could take off with the aft staircase open? The answer was simple. The CIA, in the previous years, had its interest spiked by the Boeing 727 and its aft staircase. Why? Because it could deploy troops in a war zone. Either way, the pilots accepted the request because, even though challenging, they could still be achieved, and it's with those configurations that the airplane got granted its takeoff clearance by Seattle Air Traffic Control at 7:40 p.m. after a full refueling. Anyway, after a fantastic day, everybody was back in the air. Cooper was assisted by a fantastic crew composed of Captain Scott, First Officer Ratazak, Mechanical Flight Officer Anderson, and Flight Attendant McClough, who were, alongside wondering where the joke could finally end, en route to Reno International Airport, but this time hostages of Cooper. But for this flight, of course, it was not just the 727. Two F-106 took off from the McCord Airfield, and a Lockheed T-33, another military aircraft, diverted from its initial mission, were all required to follow closely the aircraft from now on. All flew at a safe distance from the 727, flying in a S position in order to capture every instant of everything that was on board and leaving the aircraft. The move was certainly calculated by Cooper, who, after takeoff, asked McClough to open the staircase. But McClough objected, saying that this wasn't really safe and she could get sucked out of the aircraft, and I would understand that. So she asked if she could go to the cockpit to get a safety rope, and Cooper said no. McClough was certainly exhausted at this stage, but instead he asked her to head to the cockpit, but to close the partition between the coach and the first class section and never return. As McClough understood Cooper was about to escape, she begged him to take the bomb with him, to which he remained quite elusive. Maybe he will, maybe he won't. Either way, as McClough did what was instructed, she headed to the cockpit, and at 8 o'clock, whilst no one knew what was happening in the cabin, a light indicating that the staircase was open flashed in the cockpit. Using the intercom, the captain asked Cooper if he needed assistance, and at this point, the very last answer from Cooper was a no. And this was the very last interaction the crew had with Cooper for this flight. As the flight carried on and landed at Reno, McClough asked Cooper through the intercom to close the staircase, but no one was on board. As they got cleared for landing in Reno at 11 o'clock, once the aircraft was parked in the airport after a safe landing, FBI agents searched the aircraft. Cooper was nowhere to be found. Only 2 parachutes were found, as well as a clip-on tie. Oh yeah, one detail. The aircraft was flying the outskirts of Portland when the staircase creaked open. Upon the search, Cooper was missing, along with a parachute and the money. What became even more interesting was that in the years that followed, we knew that the money has never been spent, given that the notes had all serial numbers that couldn't be identified anywhere, and only part of the cash has been found near a river down Vancouver in Canada. But to this day, all we know is that Cooper survived this fall from the 727 because Vancouver was not on the flight path of Flight 305 en route to Reno. As far as we know, the pilots kept flying afterwards. And for McClough, when I told you that she had an amazing day that inspired her the rest of her career, here's why. After a few more years at the service of Northwest Airlines, she entered in a convent and became a nun. As for Cooper, no evidence were found, after what is still today a perfect heist, and it was on the 8th of July 2016, after nearly 45 years of investigation, that the FBI suspended the case and releasing to the public. This remains today the only unsolved case of air piracy. And there we have it, the elusive tale of D.B. Cooper. Amanda has become synonymous with one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in the annals of crime. As we draw this episode to a close, you're left, much like the investigator of this time, with an enigmatic parachute jump into the void. Despite the serial numbers, the sketches, and the scattered bundles of cash found years later, D.B. Cooper remains an indelible question mark in the ledger of the American folklore. He vanished into the forest, yes, but also into the realm of legends and hypotheticals. Who was D.B. Cooper? A thrill seeker, a criminal mastermind, or simply a man desperate to disappear? In the grand scheme of things, the true story might be as elusive as Cooper himself. As you ponder this airborne enigma, I invite you to share your theories and speculations in the comment section below. Are they the missing pieces of the puzzle, or just another twist in a tale that refuses to be unraveled? Until our next rendezvous with the enigmatic and the inexplicable, keep your minds open and your eyes skyward. See you next week, fellow travelers of the unknown.